In this video, we will look into a story that took place 80 years ago in a country in southern Europe, Spain. Although nowadays Spain is known for its beautiful beaches and tasteful food, this hasn't always been the case. The Spanish Civil War, which took place between 1936 and 1939, is one of the most tragic events in Spanish history, and today I would like to dive into the causes that led to its outbreak, because many of you have struggled with this topic throughout these last 2 years. First of all, I will go through the long-term causes. Second, I will look into the short-term causes. And finally, I will briefly mention the immediate causes. Regarding the long-term causes, we could go all the way back to the Carlist Wars of the 19th century, the loss of Cuba as a colony during the Spanish-American War in 1898, or the triumph of the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, which all had an impact in the eventual outbreak of the Civil War. However, I would rather stick to the events that took place in the decade prior to the establishment of the Second Spanish Republic. In order to get a general background, the following points should be mentioned. Since its unification in 1479, Spain had always been a monarchy except for a very brief period of time that nobody really remembers. By the 1920s, its government was very undemocratic, with rigged elections and effective power laying in the aristocracy. The church and the army were also very influential, oppressive, and supported conservative parties, which, little by little, alienated the peasants and industrial workers who started to support leftist unions and parties that opposed them. Also, regarding its territories, Spain was not very tightly united and found itself in a constant conflict between the capital and the regions, which most of them had their own culture, dialect, and even language. Strong movements emerged in these regions which supported independence and the creation of their own country. Regarding economics, Spain was a mostly deindustrialized agricultural economy with huge inequality, which led to the increase in support of trade unionism, anarchism, socialism, and communism. Many types of communism. However, Spain's neutrality in World War I led to an increase in exports to the countries at war and an overall economic growth. But this stopped when World War I came to an end and a huge economic crisis took place. This led to some troubled times where the violence between peasants and workers against landowners and industrialists and vice versa reached new heights. 12 different governments tried to handle the situation during the following 5 years, but none of them was able to. Therefore, in 1923, the king allowed Miguel Primo de Rivera to gain power through a military coup, just like the Italian king had allowed Mussolini to gain power a year before. This new dictatorship was modeled around Mussolini's dictatorship, and it actually put an end to some of Spain's problems, like the economic crisis and the Moroccan revolt. However, the economy stayed very weak and the Wall Street crash undermined all of Primo de Rivera's work and forced him to resign in 1930. The king called elections a year later, in 1931. These elections showed a huge support for the Republican parties and led to the voluntary exile of the king. The Second Spanish Republic was proclaimed. The Second Republic had three periods: the left-wing government from 1931 to 1933, the right-wing government from 1933 to 1936, and the left-wing Popular Front from its election in 1936 until the outbreak of the Civil War that same year. During the first government of the Republic, which lasted from 1931 to 1933 and was center-left oriented, policies were applied that aimed to reduce the influence of the army and the church, redistribute the land amongst the peasants, and give more autonomy to the regions. All of this increased social divisions. The conservative sectors of society wanted to reverse the direction of the reforms, while the more leftist sectors of society wanted to increase the pace of reform. The army attempted a failed coup in 1932, while the anarchists led several strikes and revolts. It was the assassination of 25 anarchists during one of these revolts that caused the socialists to remove their support for the government, which led to new elections in 1933. The right-wing parties won this election, and they started to reverse all the reforms that the first government made. This led to increased political agitation in the left. For example, the Catalonian government declared its independence in 1934, and the communists and anarchists led a failed revolution that same year. These moves were confronted with harsh repression from the government. These repressive measures caused the different leftist sectors to unite under the so-called Popular Front. This coalition of parties would go on to win the next general elections in 1936. The Popular Front began to apply back the policies that the right-wing government had reversed. This would again lead to an increased social division, which led to the immediate causes for the outbreak of the war. Right after the victory of the Popular Front in the elections, the right-wing parties and the army began to plan a military coup. By the 13th of July of 1936, that plan was already drawn out. However, that day, a prominent right-wing politician was assassinated, which hugely increased tensions and gave the military the excuse they needed to justify their coup. The government tried to prevent any possible coup by spreading the military leaders across the country. For example, Franco was sent to the Canary Islands in Africa. Also, the plan was discovered and the army was forced to act quickly, and the coup was executed earlier than expected, with the colonial troops in Morocco revolting on the 17th of July and the regular troops in Spain revolting on the 18th. However, the army was unable to seize power and the coup failed. The government formed worker and peasant militias to defend itself, and the Spanish Civil War had officially begun. It would end 3 years later with the victory of the military, which led to the establishment of a military dictatorship that would last until 1975 and still affects Spanish society in a big way. But that's another story. Thank you for watching, and I hope that I made this topic more understandable.